Welcome to the Deep Dive, where our mission is to cut through the noise, examine stacks of complex, often thorny source material, and distill the essential knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
And today's subject is, well, it's arguably one of the most challenging we have ever undertaken.
I would agree. We are doing an exhaustive examination of two highly controversial and politically charged sources. They both explore the doctrines of traditional Judaism, its historical role across millennia, and its subsequent cultural influence in the West.
That is absolutely correct. And you know, the material we are diving into today touches upon theology, history, economics, law, and it is highly volatile. It features two remarkably distinct and often directly opposing narratives.
Always is putting it lightly.
Right. So we are here as impartial guides. Our commitment is to thoroughly report and synthesize the claims, the connections, and the opposing viewpoints presented in these texts. We want to ensure you gain total clarity on the powerful narratives within the sources without endorsing the validity of any particular view they contain.
And that's the key. We're looking at the sources themselves. Our material establishes this profound dichotomy. On one side, we have these extensive excerpts focusing on the contentious claims of figures like the late Israel Shahak and later the scholar Ariel Toph.
And that side paints a picture of traditional Jewish religion and history through an extremely critical and frankly exclusionary lens.
Exactly. And on the other side, we have a second set of excerpts that directly address, contextualize, and often strongly refute these and other common historical and religious criticisms. This second source often comes from a perspective that tries to distinguish between what's plausible and what is, and I'm quoting here, utter bullshit.
It's a direct confrontation of ideas.
It really is. And it forces you, the learner, to confront two completely different models attempting to explain the same historical friction.
It is a critical exercise in understanding how history is interpreted. So, okay, let's unpack this and start with the foundational figure for much of the critique found in Source 1. That would be the work of Israel Shahak and how his unexpected accuracy served as a catalyst for a radical reassessment by some observers.
Right. So let's set the stage. The narrative surrounding Shahak in our source material begins with a truly riveting personal anecdote. It's told by Ron Unz, one of the authors whose excerpts we examined. And he recounts how his own perceptions of the Middle East conflict just drastically shifted in 1982. This was during the first Israeli invasion of Lebanon.
Which, of course, culminated in the notorious Sabra Shatila massacre.
Exactly. Up until that time, the author notes that when you're reading mainstream Western media, the only person taking a completely contrarian view of Israeli policy was this seemingly fringe, isolated figure, Israel Shahak.
And based on the occasional quotes appearing in the press, the initial description of Shahak was, well, it was dismissive. He was called an apparently diehard and delusional Stalinist.
Right. He seemed totally out of step with every mainstream political and media analyst. Just this lone, angry voice.
And this is where that personal shift for the author occurs. Shahak had predicted, even before the fact, that the Israeli defense minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, after besieging Beirut, he had marched there with the specific intent of organizing a massacre of the Palestinians.
He didn't just say it might happen, he said that was the intent, and he even predicted the pretext.
He did. He said the slaughter would shortly take place under the pretext of assuring the safety of Palestinian women and children, a deeply cynical prediction.
And then it happened.
When the Sabra Shatila slaughter indeed occurred shortly afterward, apparently with heavy Israeli involvement and complicity, a fact that's now widely accepted, the source author concluded something pretty profound.
Which was?
That if this seemingly crazy communist fanatic had been 100% right, while every single mainstream journalist and commentator had been 100% wrong, then his entire understanding of the world required a total recalibration.
A complete reset. Because if Shahak's political predictions proved that accurate, then perhaps his deep historical and theological sources, well, they deserved a much more rigorous examination.
Exactly. And once Unz looked deeper, the initial assumptions about Shahak's background were found to be completely misleading.
Which suggests the political description was a function of his isolation, not his actual ideology. He was labeled a Stalinist because he was so far outside the acceptable consensus.
Precisely. The source emphasizes that the initial assumptions were, quote, entirely in error. Far from being some ideological fringe figure, Shahak was actually an award-winning chemistry professor at Hebrew University.
So a respected academic.
A very respected academic. Furthermore, he was anything but a communist. His personal doubts about socialism had actually left him politically isolated within Israel. His only connection to Israel's tiny communist party was purely functional.
Functional in what way?
It was solely because they were the only group willing to stand up for the basic human rights issues that were his central focus. He aligned with them on that one issue, and that was it.
That dramatically changes the context, doesn't it? Suddenly, this critical voice becomes a respected academic, operating from within the very system he was critiquing.
And that gave his central work enormous weight. The book that synthesized his analysis was Jewish History, Jewish Religion, the weight of 3,000 years. And the source notes that this was not some obscure, self-published tract.
No, it was endorsed by some very big names.
A remarkable cross-section of prominent public intellectuals, Christopher Hitchens, Gore Vidal, Noam Chomsky, Edward Said.
Wow.
And it was praised by respectable publications like the London Review of Books.
It's important to synthesize why, though. Why would these highly secular, often liberal public intellectuals champion a book focused on obscure religious doctrine? It seems like an odd fit.
Well, the appeal, as suggested by the context, wasn't theological. It was political and structural. Shahak was arguing that a distinct, non-ethical, and highly exclusionary religious core provided the structural explanation for certain historical exploitation patterns and modern Israeli state behaviors.
Ah, okay. So for secular liberals and dissidents, this provided a powerful, documented internal critique of what they perceived as geopolitical hypocrisy.
Exactly. That pedigree and that political utility made it much, much harder to simply dismiss his claims out of hand. And the source author, Unz, went to the length of hiring a graduate student to verify the hundreds of references in the book.
And the result?
He reported that all of Shahak's claims seemed to be accurately sourced within traditional Jewish texts.
So if the source material claims his facts regarding the traditional texts were verified, even if the interpretation remains controversial, then we really have to look closely at what he asserted to be the core doctrines of traditional Judaism.
What's often referred to as Talmudic Judaism.
Right. So let's delve into that structure and those claims.
Okay, let's do it.
So transitioning to the heart of Shahak's challenge to conventional understanding. To really get what he's claiming, we first have to establish the structural hierarchy of these religious texts, particularly for, a non-specialist listener.
That's vital. Shahak asserted that traditionally religious Jews pay very little attention to the majority of the Old Testament or the Torah, which is just the first 5 books.
So not what most outsiders would think of as the core text.
Not at all. In fact, he claimed many learned rabbis may remain largely ignorant of the Old Testament's contents. Instead, the center of their religious worldview is the Talmud.
And the Talmud is?
The Talmud is described as an enormously large, complex, and sometimes contradictory mass of secondary writings, debate, and commentary built up over many, many centuries. This is why the doctrine is often called Talmudic Judaism. It's like the operating system of the faith.
Okay. And there's another set of texts involved as well, right? The Kabbalah.
Yes. Among large portions of the faithful, the Talmud is supplemented by the Kabbalah, which is another large collection of writings. This one is focused primarily on mysticism, numerology, and various forms of magic.
So Shahak's core claim is that because these commentaries and interpretations are the real center of the religion, much of what outsiders take for granted in the Old Testament is viewed in a radically different light.
Exactly. And this leads directly to his most fundamental claim, which really challenges the entire Western conception of the faith.
The reinterpreting of monotheism.
The claim is startling. Shahak argued that the religion of many traditional Jews is, and I quote, not at all monotheistic.
Not at all. That's a huge claim.
It is. He said it contains a wide variety of different male and female gods who have quite complex relations to each other. And these entities and their properties vary enormously depending upon the different Jewish subsects and which portions of the Talmud and the Kabbalah they prioritize.
Wait, hold on. If they're all praying side by side in the synagogue, how can they possibly reconcile such radically different beliefs about the very nature of God?
Well, the source uses a fantastic example to illustrate this. It's the traditional religious cry, "The Lord is one."
Okay, sounds pretty standard monotheistic.
To many, it is. Many Jews interpret this as a standard monotheistic affirmation. However, Shahak claimed that large numbers of other Jews believe this declaration instead refers to the achievement of a sexual union between the primary male and female divine entities.
A sexual union.
Yes. And the point Shahak emphasized is that Jews having such radically different, even polytheistic views see absolutely no difficulty in praying side by side. They just interpret their identical chants in very different fashions.
That speaks to the nature of ritual being primary over any kind of specific theological interpretation.
Exactly. And that brings us to the most bizarre and often seized upon claim, the alleged worship of Satan.
Right. This one is difficult to process.
The source claims that religious Jews apparently pray to Satan almost as readily as they pray to God, or at least to entities that would be considered satanic or demonic in other faiths.
So depending on the rabbinical school, they might be directing their rituals to completely different supernatural entities.
That's the claim. Depending upon the various rabbinical schools, the particular rituals and sacrifices they practice may be aimed at enlisting the support of one or the other. And again, Shahak emphasizes that as long as the rituals are properly followed, the Satan worshippers and the God worshippers consider each other equally pious.
They're just part of a slightly different tradition.
Right.
But wait, if the rituals are so rigid, I mean, the source mentions things like washing hands 3 times clockwise versus counterclockwise. How does source 1 reconcile that level of theological pluralism with the totalitarian control over ideology that Shahak claims existed? Wouldn't praying to Satan be grounds for, immediate ideological execution by the rabbinical authorities?
That is an excellent point about the internal contradiction, and Shahak's answer is functional. The focus on ritual correctness is the enforcement mechanism. Interpretation is secondary because it rarely affects the ritual itself.
So adherence to the halakha, the Jewish law, is what defines piety, not your internal interpretation of who benefits from it.
The ritual is absolutely uppermost, and the interpretation is rather secondary. This focus on ritual over true theological intention also manifests in claims of practices that are explicitly intended to trick God.
Trick God.
Yes. The source notes the strange claim that many traditional rituals are explicitly intended to fool or trick God, or his angels, or sometimes Satan.
Okay, give me an example of that.
For example, certain prayers must be uttered in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, and the grounds for this. That holy angels supposedly don't understand Aramaic.
So the idea is to, what? Sneak the prayer past them.
Precisely. The rationale here is that the angel's confusion allows those verses to slip by unimpeded and take effect without any divine interference. It's like spiritual engineering, a way of working around divine or celestial constraints using linguistic loopholes.
This highlights the power of legalistic interpretation. And this leads us to what I think is the critical structural insight Shahak presented: the power of accumulated commentary to fundamentally reverse foundational ethics.
Exactly. This legalistic nitpickery and transformation of meaning isn't limited to divine trickery. Shahak highlighted how explicit mandates could be transformed into their opposites over the centuries through subsequent commentary. A core example involves the pay of religious leaders.
Tell us about that shift.
Maimonides, who is one of the highest rabbinical authorities, absolutely prohibited rabbis from being paid for their religious teaching. He went so far as to declare that any rabbi who received a salary was an evil robber condemned to everlasting torment.
That's pretty unambiguous.
You would think so. Yet later rabbis, the source explains, reinterpreted this statement to mean something entirely different. And today, almost all rabbis collect salaries.
So the core insight here, which I can see appealing to the secular critics who endorse Shahak, is that the tradition demonstrates that legalistic interpretation holds supremacy over the prophetic mandate.
A functional fact far more significant than the lurid details. The accumulated weight of commentary can effectively nullify the original ethical intent.
And finally, there's the aspect of widespread superstition and magic connecting back to the Kabbalah. We're not just talking about theology here, but day-to-day practices.
No, not at all. Shahak detailed that traditional Jewish life up until very recent times was often dominated by highly superstitious practices. We're talking magical charms, potions, spells, incantations, hexes, curses, and sacred talismans.
And rabbis were involved in this.
They frequently served an important secondary role as sorcerers. And this is not just historical curiosity. Shahak noted that this remains true today among enormously influential rabbis in Israel and the New York City area.
And this gives context to the famous legend of the Golem of Prague.
Precisely. The Golem legend described the successful use of rabbinical magic to animate a giant creature built of clay. And this isn't just ancient folklore. The sources confirm that after Shahak's writings were published, influential rabbis constantly attacked him with all sorts of spells and fearful curses aimed at achieving his death or illness. This level of emphasis on practical magic is crucial to understanding the cultural world Shahak was describing. It's very far removed from the modern, secular, or reformed image of Judaism, and it's fundamentally based on working the system through ritual, whether that system is divine or magical.
Okay, so if the nature of ritual is paramount internally, as you've described, let's examine how that highly ordered, legalistic, and often magical worldview translates to the relationship with the outside world. This is what Shahak called the darker side of the traditional doctrine.
Right. If the ritualistic aspects of traditional Judaism are merely eccentric or unique, Shahak claimed there's a far darker side, which involves the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, who are frequently referred to by the derogatory term goyim.
And we must emphasize again, we're reporting on the extremist interpretations that Shahak claimed to have found in these traditional texts, which he asserted were core doctrines of the faith. So what are the claims regarding the fundamental status of non-Jews?
The claim is rooted in a fundamental theological distinction. Jews have divine souls, while goyim do not. They are described as being merely beasts in the shape of men.
Beasts in the shape of men, that's extreme.
It is. And the primary reason for the existence of non-Jews, according to Shahak's analysis of the text, is to serve as the slaves of Jews.
And the source provides a modern example of this.
It does. It cites a specific contemporary example. In 2010, Israel's top Sephardic rabbi allegedly used his weekly sermon to openly declare that the only reason for the existence of non-Jews is to serve Jews and do work for them. The ultimate implication, Shahak argued, is the eventual enslavement or extermination of all non-Jews, justified by this profound intrinsic difference in value.
That leads directly to the claims about the valuation of life, which, if true, has deeply concerning real-world policy implications.
Indeed. The core claim is that Jewish lives allegedly have infinite value, and non-Jewish ones none at all.
None at all.
None at all. The source cites a prominent Israeli rabbi who, in a published article, explained that if a Jew needed a liver, it would be, quote, perfectly fine and indeed obligatory to kill an innocent Gentile and take his.
And the source then adds context to that, right?
It does. It adds context by noting that Israel is widely regarded as one of the world's centers of organ trafficking, suggesting a potential policy link to these underlying beliefs.
And how did these religious laws affect simple humanitarian actions, like, just saving a life?
Well, saving the life of a non-Jew is generally considered improper or even prohibited under strict interpretations of the law. Furthermore, attempting to save a non-Jewish life on the Sabbath is deemed an absolute violation of religious edict.
Is this just an academic point, or does it have real-world application?
The source claims it does. This position was reportedly adopted by a religiously minded military doctor in Israel, and his stance was supported by the country's highest religious authorities, demonstrating that this is not merely some ancient academic concern.
However, the sources also indicate there are exceptions to these rules. It's not an absolute prohibition in all cases.
No, and the exceptions are key. The source explains that these prohibitions are waived only to avoid Gentile resentment or hostility.
So it's a practical consideration, not a moral one.
Exactly. For example, the prohibition against Jewish physicians treating non-Jews is waived for powerful non-Jews, especially national leaders, whose favor might provide benefits to the Jewish community. Ordinary non-Jews may also be aided if failure to do so would stir up vengeful hostility from their friends and relatives, causing difficulty for other Jews.
So the law is focused on self-preservation and expediency, not on any kind of universal humanitarian grounds.
That's the argument. The source even notes that any simple expression of friendship toward a non-Jew is itself a violation of holy principles.
This inherent hostility is reportedly not limited to general non-Jews, though. Christianity is singled out as a unique abomination.
That is the claim. The source states that while religious Judaism has a negative view towards all non-Jews, Christianity in particular is regarded as a total abomination, which must be wiped from the face of the earth. This contrasts sharply with the view of pious Muslims, for example, who consider Jesus a holy prophet.
So what are the specific theological claims Shahak attributes to the Talmud regarding Jesus?
According to Shahak's analysis of the Jewish Talmud, Jesus is perhaps the vilest being who ever lived.
Wow.
And he is condemned to spend eternity in the bottommost pit of hell, immersed in a boiling vat of excrement.
Okay. And what about the Christian holy texts?
The Christian Bible is regarded as purest evil, and burning Bibles is considered a very praiseworthy act if the circumstances permit.
And this hostility extends to rituals targeting Christian symbols and places.
It does. Pious Jews are enjoined to always spit 3 times at any cross or church they encounter and to direct a curse at all Christian cemeteries. Furthermore, Shahak claimed that many deeply religious Jews utter a daily prayer for the immediate extermination of all Christians.
And there's been debate about this in Israel.
The source mentions that prominent Israeli rabbis have sometimes publicly debated whether Jewish power is great enough to finally destroy the Christian churches in the Holy Land, though most urged prudence until they gained additional strength.
So if these doctrines are so fiercely hostile, how did Jews manage to live peacefully, or at least survive, as minorities within these Gentile societies for 2 millennia without just constant open warfare?
The answer, according to Shahak, lies in a very specific doctrine, the doctrine of subterfuge and concealment.
Explain that.
Since a religious doctrine so unswervingly hostile to outsiders would naturally present considerable obstacles for peaceful coexistence, an elaborate methodology of subterfuge, concealment, and dissimulation developed over the centuries.
And this is justified by what?
It's justified by the divine mandate to preserve Jewish life and well-being above all else. This mandate supersedes almost all other religious considerations.
And this strategy of concealment included deliberately misrepresenting sacred texts.
Yes, the methodology includes the mistranslation of sacred texts or the complete exclusion of crucial sections in public dealings. The goal is to minimize the possibility of the Gentile population becoming aware of these beliefs and the behaviors they promote. The source is scathing toward rabbis who publicly express liberal integrationist views while allegedly concealing these fundamental tenets.
And the example used to illustrate this political concealment involves the American Civil Rights Movement.
Yes. Shahak argued that according to mainstream Talmudic doctrine, Black Africans are traditionally placed somewhere between people and monkeys.
Okay.
And he noted that the numerous American rabbis who eagerly worked with Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black civil rights leaders during the 1950s and 60s strictly concealed this religious dogma.
So while publicly denouncing American racism,
They were allegedly concealing a deeply racist dogma from their own texts. And this concealment, Shahak argued, was presumably to achieve a political quid pro quo beneficial to Jewish interests with America's substantial Black population.
given this necessary doctrine of concealment toward outsiders, how did the rabbinical authorities maintain the purity of the system internally? How did they ensure that no reform or deviation took hold?
Well, that brings us to Shahak's final point about the internal organization of traditional Jewish life, which he described as utterly totalitarian.
Totalitarian.
Utterly totalitarian. He emphasized the nature of traditional Jewish society, where rabbis allegedly held the power of life and death over their congregants. They constantly sought to punish ideological deviation or heresy.
And they were prevented from doing so by outside forces.
Shahak noted that they were often outraged when stronger European states began to prohibit these private executions. The famous Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, for instance, only survived a private execution attempt by his own community because the Dutch authorities refused to allow his fellow Jews to kill him for heresy.
So we've now covered the full scope of Source One's claims, a profoundly dark, extractive, magical, and totalitarian view of history and theology. And to be crystal clear, we're simply reporting the powerful narrative contained in this source.
Absolutely. So now let's examine how this doctrine allegedly manifested in history, particularly in economic and political roles. And here we'll begin to interweave Source Two's counterarguments to provide some immediate balance.
Great. Let's move from the doctrine to the historical application.
Okay, moving from the doctrinal claims to the claimed historical role. The sources explore how this foundation of intense separation and what Source One calls a hate thy neighbor doctrine might have created long-term cultural ripple effects.
Right. The source argues that a highly distinctive cultural pattern and set of social attitudes, even if the origin of those sentiments is unknown to a wider population, can enhance an unrecognized influence in the wider society.
And this influence often manifests in specific economic roles. Source One draws a very provocative parallel between Jewish economic intermediaries and military mercenaries.
Explain that parallel.
The source suggests that political rulers who harshly exploit their subjects sometimes use well-rewarded mercenaries, often of foreign origin, to repress the population without any human sympathy.
Because they have no connection to the local people.
Exactly. And Shahak suggested that some of the most common traditional economic niches of European Jews, like tax farming and the Arenda estate management system of Eastern Europe, should be understood in a similar light.
Okay, we need to define Arenda concisely for the listener. What was that system?
The Arenda system involved leasing large estates, we're talking vast land holdings, from noblemen. The manager, who was often Jewish, was then responsible for brutally extracting rents, fees, and crucially, liquor taxes from the Slavic peasant population on behalf of that nobleman.
And Source One's interpretation of this role is?
Source 1 views this role as Jews being more likely to extract every last penny of value due to their alleged antipathy for all non-Jews. This ensured that such behavior was minimally tempered by any human sympathy, making them ruthlessly effective mercenaries for the ruling class.
And Source One claims this pattern started very early in Western history.
Yes. It notes that Jews first entered England in the train of William the Conqueror, allegedly to help him and his victorious Norman lords effectively exploit the subjugated Anglo-Saxon population they now ruled. This historical pattern suggests a recurring role as extractive economic enforcers.
This naturally connects the issue of money lending and usury, which our sources address from completely opposing angles. While Source 1 implies this antipathy drove the ruthlessness, Source 2 argues that the dominance of money lending was actually legally mandated by both Jewish and Christian law.
And that's the crucial distinction where we introduce balance. Source 2 confirms that money lending at interest was historically dominated by Jews in Europe precisely because Christian authorities forbade Christians from charging interest to other Christians.
The religious prohibition of usury.
Exactly. And this prohibition was based on Old Testament law, specifically Deuteronomy 23.1928.
Which demands zero interest loans for a Hebrew's brother, but explicitly allows charging interest to a stranger or a foreigner.
Exactly. So the economic niche was created by a combination of Jewish religious law, which allowed interest to outsiders, and Christian religious law, which forbade interest among themselves.
So it was a structural opening.
It was. And Source 2 notes that this dominance continues in Western finance today and acknowledges that, well, those in debt tend to vilify money lenders. So Source 2 links the historical vilification directly to this debt dynamic rather than purely theological malice. It claims people are willing to believe nonsense and make false accusations to get out of paying their debts.
Okay. Another claimed historical role addressed by Source 1 is slavery.
Right. Shahak's source claims that since Jews spent 2,000 years living as a diaspora people with a tightly bound transnational trading network, and because their religious traditions regarded slavery as the natural and appropriate lot of all non-Jews, they were allegedly some of the leading slave traders of medieval Europe.
And the source makes a more modern claim as well.
It does. Closer to home, the source cites the Nation of Islam's 1991 publication, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 1, which allegedly persuasively documented the enormous role Jews had played in the American slave trade.
Okay, moving into the 20th century, Source 1 discusses the role of Jews in political upheaval, specifically the Russian Revolution and the subsequent control of media.
Yes. The source mentions the controversy surrounding the Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Whispers of his supposed anti-Semitism arose because he hinted at the very prominent role of Jews in financing and leading the Bolshevik Revolution.
And subsequently in running the state security apparatus.
And subsequently staffing the NKVD and administering the Gulag labor camps.
And his historical work on the subject was allegedly suppressed in the West because it addressed this topic too candidly.
That's the claim. Solzhenitsyn's 2-volume history, 200 Years Together, documented the tangled relationship between Jews and Russians. It quickly appeared in Russian, French, and German, but the source alleges that no English translation has ever been authorized after nearly 2 decades.
Why not?
The book also discussed the Tsar's attempts to mitigate what it called the extremely exploitative relationship between Jews and Slavic peasants, based on liquor dealing and money lending, a detail that American publishers reportedly found inappropriate for their audience.
This thread then continues with the narrative surrounding the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin.
Following the Soviet collapse in 1991, Source 1 claims that Russia soon fell under the overwhelming domination of a small group of oligarchs almost entirely of Jewish background.
And the result for the country.
A decade of total misery and impoverishment for the general Russian population. However, when Vladimir Putin regained control, these trends allegedly reversed and the lives of ordinary Russians improved.
And this is linked to media perception of Putin.
Yes. The source asserts that America's media organs, which were overwhelmingly friendly toward Russia when it was under Jewish oligarchic rule, then began to demonize Putin more fiercely than any world leader since Hitler.
And the final piece of the historical puzzle in Source 1 concerns the acquisition of media power in the West, which the source links directly to political influence.
Right. Citing Columbia University professor Tim Wu's book, The Master Switch, the source claims a consistent pattern. Powerful mass media technologies, film, radio, television, were invented and pioneered by Gentiles, mostly of Anglo-Saxon origin. But in each case, control was allegedly seized by ruthless Jewish businessmen who sometimes destroyed the lives and careers of the original creators. By the 1950s, nearly all of America's leading concentrations of electronic media power, with the sole exception of Disney, were solidly in Jewish hands.
And the source argues that in an open society, these become the central levers of political influence.
That is the claim, and this connects directly to the concept of a hostile elite and the phenomenon of Jewish berserkers, which are described as the mechanism for protecting this power.
Okay, what is a hostile elite?
The term was coined by Kevin MacDonald. It describes the negative consequences when a country comes under the control of an elite that has limited connection to and is ruthlessly extractive toward the general population.
The source uses a pretty stark analogy for this.
Very stark. It says, if a majority non-German population were ruled by fanatically pro-German leaders, they would fare far worse than the German population did under Hitler. This is used to explain current economic disparities in America, linking the economic trajectory to the time when this ethnic transformation of ruling elites was allegedly underway in the early 1970s.
And the mechanism for protecting this elite from any scrutiny is intimidation, which is enforced by a specific type of cultural warrior.
Yes. The source suggests the existence of a biological submorph of exceptionally fanatical individuals, the so-called Jewish berserkers.
And their role is?
They are on hair-trigger alert to launch verbal and sometimes physical attacks against anyone challenging topics sensitive to Jewish interests. These individuals are seen as enforcing taboos, swiftly destroying the careers of brave or foolhardy public figures, and intimidating writers and politicians into silence.
All for the benefit of Jewish interests as a whole.
That is the argument, and it's emphasized with an anecdote where an eminent neoconservative scholar, nervously glancing around, lowered his voice to attribute the leftward skew of intellectual elites simply to, "It's the Jews."
We've now covered the full scope of Source One's claims. Profoundly dark, extractive, and totalitarian view of history. The berserkers are, in this view, the shock troops enforcing the silence around these claims. To be clear, we are simply reporting the source.
Absolutely. Now let's bring in Source 2, which claims that the most serious historical accusation rooted in these tensions is, and I quote again, utter bullshit.
Right. Let's get into the blood libel controversy.
This section represents a direct collision of narratives. We have to look first at the Toph hypothesis, which suggested there might be historical evidence for the blood libel, and then Source 2's powerful theological and socio-economic rebuttal.
Okay, let's start with Ariel Toph's research. He was a prominent scholar of Jewish Renaissance and medieval studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel, and he was the son of the chief rabbi of Rome. So, a serious academic from a very respected background.
Very much so.
What was his hypothesis, which he published in Blood Passovers back in 2007?
Well, the accusation being addressed is the notorious Christian superstition that Jews sometimes kidnap small Christian children to drain their blood for use in various magic rituals, especially for the Purim or Passover holiday.
And Toph's research.
According to Source 1, his research suggested a fairly strong likelihood that these seemingly impossible beliefs were actually true, at least among small, isolated groups of Ashkenazi Jews during the medieval period.
That is an explosive conclusion. What evidence did he present to support this deeply controversial idea?
He had several lines of evidence. First, Toph claimed that a considerable number of Ashkenazi Jews traditionally regarded Christian blood as having powerful magical properties and considered it a very valuable component of certain important ritual observances at particular religious holidays.
Okay. What else?
Secondly, He noted that the detailed descriptions of ritualistic murder practices were described very similarly in locations widely separated by geography, language, culture, and time period.
Which suggests.
It suggests these were independent observations of the same rite, not just, a local rumor spreading from town to town. And thirdly, he argued that when accused Jews were caught and questioned, they often correctly described obscure religious rituals which could not possibly have been known to their Gentile interrogators.
Making the confessions unlikely to have been coerced or concocted by the authorities?
That was his argument.
But despite the scholarly nature of Toph's background, the book was allegedly suppressed almost immediately.
Yes. The initial print run sold out on the first day, but the source claims that activist groups applied sufficient pressure to cancel all additional publication, including the planned English edition. Professor Toph, despite attempting to stand his ground, eventually retracted and apologized, citing the enormous pressure that was applied.
Okay, now let's look at the counter-narrative, which is the complete opposite. Source 2 addresses this specific accusation directly and very forcefully.
Very forcefully. Source 2 asserts that blood libel accusations fail the smell test utterly and are utter bullshit.
And the core argument against the claim.
It's fundamentally theological and practical. The drinking or ritual use of human blood runs utterly counter to the laws of the Torah. It violates the Noahide commandments, which prohibit the consumption of blood, a prohibition that applies to all humans, not just Jews.
So it's a profound violation of foundational law, not just an ethical boundary.
It's far beyond an ethical boundary. It's a matter of ritual purity. Source 2 stresses that Jews treat human blood as nuclear waste. To even touch human blood is to become ritually unclean, which requires elaborate purification ceremonies.
And the source uses a modern example for this.
It does. It points out that modern Orthodox Jews are so focused on dietary purity that they take extreme measures to avoid consuming animal blood in foods like corned beef, ensuring the meat is thoroughly salted and drained. So the idea of engaging in ritual murder to consume human blood, or even use it ritually, is deemed wholly nonsensical by Source 2.
So that makes the confession evidence suspect.
Highly suspect. The implication is that it must have been the result of torture or some kind of religious fantasy projected onto the victims.
If the accusation is total nonsense, according to Source 2, where did this lurid historical fiction come from? What's the origin story?
Source 2 provides a socioeconomic explanation, and it links right back to the financial role we discussed earlier. The source argues that people don't like paying their debts and are willing to believe nonsense and make false accusations to get out of paying their debts.
So it's a tool for debt cancellation.
Exactly. Noblemen, kings, and commoners all ran up debts, and what better way to get out of them than to stir up the peasants against the Jewish moneylenders using extra lurid and ridiculous tales. This could lead to expulsion or violence, which conveniently canceled all the debts.
And the source argues this practice extends to modern times.
It does, citing the Tsar's secret police writing the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion as a way to shift political blame onto the Jews.
That's a profound contrast. A religious theory of hidden ritual murder versus an economic theory of debt evasion and scapegoating. This discussion leads us naturally back to the Jewish approach to law, which Source 2 argues is highly distinctive and a primary source of historical friction.
Yes, Source 2 highlights that the Christian ideal, based on Matthew 5.25-26, calls for Christians to attempt to resolve disputes privately before resorting to legal authorities.
Settle out of court, basically.
Right. Source 2 states that Jews have no such constraint and are quicker to sue, even suing each other. This is presented not as malevolence, but as a highly left-brained approach to law.
And where does that come from?
It stems from centuries of haggling and nitpicking with God over supplemental holy books containing reams of legal nitpickery.
So the sheer volume of the Talmud and its focus on legal minutiae has created a cultural predisposition towards lawfare.
Precisely. It's an intellectual structure. And this approach was allegedly adopted by Donald Trump. Source 2 makes the provocative claim that Trump, whose mentor was the Jewish lawyer Roy Cohn, fights like a Jew when it comes to legal battles.
The source labels Trump a Judeo-Christian in his approach to lawfare.
Yes, and argues it has proven highly effective against political attempts to thwart him with endless legal challenges.
And this legalistic, unconstrained thinking also had implications on Wall Street, providing a distinct advantage.
That's the argument. Source 2 argues that part of the Jewish takeover of Wall Street occurred because older white Jew law firms and financial institutions operated under unwritten gentleman's constraints.
Things that were just not done.
Exactly. Actions that were considered improper in the WASP-dominated finance world. Up-and-coming Jewish firms allegedly lacked such constraints, enabling them to bypass traditional social barriers and prosper mightily during the hostile takeover era of the 1980s.
So we have two very different structural explanations for what is often called Jewish influence. Shahak and his proponents claim it stems from a dark, exclusionary, and magical religious core.
While Source 2 claims it stems from historically mandated economic niches, a highly detailed left-brain legal approach, and the willingness to operate without certain gentleman's constraints. This dichotomy leads us to the surprising complexity of ideological involvement.
Right, let's get into that.
So Source 2 provides a comprehensive overview of the broad and often contradictory involvement of Jews across all sorts of political and intellectual movements. This really challenges the notion that their influence is directed by a single monolithic ideology.
And the best example used in the source is the contrast between Marxism and anti-Marxism. While Source 1 heavily emphasized the prominent Jewish role in financing and leading the Bolshevik Revolution.
Source 2 clarifies that Karl Marx himself was a secular Jew who hated Judaism and all religion. This suggests his ideological motivations were not necessarily tied to any kind of traditional religious identity.
And while many Jews were active in the Marxist movement, Source 2 emphasizes that Jews also dominated the anti-Marxist side. This illustrates the diversity within the group.
Absolutely.
So who are some of the key anti-Marxist figures mentioned to demonstrate this split?
The examples are stark. Roy Cohn, who prosecuted Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and served as Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel during the anti-communist purges of the 1950s.
A famous anti-communist.
One of the most famous. Another was John von Neumann, a towering figure in mathematics and physics. He was critical in developing the H-bomb and even called for using it on the Soviets preemptively while the U.S. still held nuclear superiority.
Very aggressive anti-communist stance.
Extremely.
This pattern of dominating opposing viewpoints continues into economic theory as well, right?
Yes, and this is where the complexity truly shines. Source 2 notes that Jewish intellectuals built much of the theoretical foundations of modern libertarianism. It cites figures like Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand.
And on the other side.
They also dominated the mainstream defense of capitalism, exemplified by Nobel laureate Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. Friedman is famously associated with monetarism, focusing on controlling the money supply to manage inflation and advocating for free markets.
But the source notes that the competing economic schools of thought are also Jew-heavy.
Counterintuitively, yes. The competing macroeconomic Austrian school, which is very hawkish on deficit spending, is also highly influenced by Jewish figures, including Ludwig von Mises and, again, Murray Rothbard.
So Rothbard is on both sides.
He's a key figure in both libertarianism and the Austrian school. The Austrian school, unlike the Chicago school, strongly advocates for sound money, often silver or gold standards, and focuses heavily on business cycle theory caused by central bank intervention.
So what Source 2 is highlighting is that prominent Jewish figures provided the intellectual bedrock for fundamentally opposing economic philosophies.
Exactly. It suggests their intellectual and cultural influence isn't monochromatic. It's not one single agenda.
And Source 2 even points out Jewish prominence within the dissident right itself, the very movement often critical of perceived Jewish influence.
Absolutely. The source notes that if you look at any U.S. political movement worth its salt, you will find prominent Jews. This includes figures within the dissident right, such as Curtis Yarvin, known as Mencius Moldbug, who advocates for monarchy, Ilana Mercer, and even Ron Unz himself, who hosted the original source material. This is all used to underscore the point that Jewish individuals are all over everywhere, on every side of the ideological spectrum, which complicates any simple model of a unified elite acting in lockstep.
That complexity really challenges the simplified hostile elite model by showing profound internal disagreement. So let's move to the discussion of Jewish origins and identity, which includes the highly unusual Carthaginian theory proposed by Ron Unz.
Right. Ron Unz proposed this unique claim that modern Jews are descendants of Carthaginians who mass converted. It's a theory he apparently shares with H.G. Wells.
And is evidence for this.
The hypothesis is supported by the claim that Jews were historically a proselytizing religion. Unz cites authors who estimate that the number of converts was huge, on the order of 7 to 8% of the entire Roman Empire's population.
And why Carthaginians specifically?
Owens argued that this explains the rapid shift in historical character. It took them from agrarian bumpkins to urban traders and financiers in the post-Second Temple period. He claimed that the Carthaginians were likely candidates for mass conversion since they already practiced circumcision.
And he made a link to the Kabbalah as well.
He did. He made parallels between the Kabbalah and Phoenician religion, suggesting a cultural lineage.
So how does Source 2, which we are using for context and rebuttal, respond to this Carthaginian theory?
Source 2 dismisses it as nonsense.
Okay, on what grounds?
The rebuttal includes several key points. First, the massive conversion number seems intuitively too high based on the narrative presented in the New Testament. Second, Ashkenazi Jews are described as inbred due to endogamy, which conflicts with a history of such widespread mass conversion from external populations.
And what about the financial aspect?
The theory ignores that ancient Hebrews already practiced finance. Lending to foreigners was explicitly allowed in Deuteronomy, and they spent 70 years in Babylon, which is characterized as the home of modern finance and advanced financial instruments.
So the idea that they were just agrarian bumpkins is incorrect.
According to Source 2, yes.
And what about the alleged Kabbalah link to the Carthaginians?
Source 2 believes Kabbalah seems like a sophisticated, complicated magical system with roots in a religion gone archaic and intellectual. The Carthaginian religion, by contrast, was described as vital and raw, still practicing human sacrifice.
A completely different feel.
Completely. So Source 2 favors the theory that Kabbalah was likely a sophisticated system picked up from the Babylonians, who operated a multinational empire, a setting that tends to render the native religion weaker but more adaptable and esoteric. Source 2 also argues that the Pharisees were too racist to convert despised Canaanites or Carthaginians in such large numbers.
Finally, let's wrap up with the religious and prophetic speculation presented in Source 2, which tries to make sense of the modern geopolitical and legal realities through the lens of ancient biblical prophecy.
Right, specifically the promises made to Abraham. And this is where Source 2 gets highly speculative.
What's the suggestion?
The suggestion is that the promises made to Abraham were split when Jacob blessed his sons. Judah, the Jews, received the blessing of providing lawgivers, the promise that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, and having a hand in the neck of thine enemies, suggesting military or punitive success.
In Joseph's sons.
Joseph's sons, conversely, received the promise of becoming a multitude of nations, which is often interpreted as the Anglo-Saxon or Northern European nations.
But why does this prophecy remain relevant, especially since Christianity views the Old Covenant as having been fulfilled or rendered obsolete by the arrival of Jesus?
Well, Source 2 acknowledges that a straight reading of Genesis 49.1 suggests the scepter passed from Judah when the Messiah, Shiloh, came. However, the author notes the many later data points of Jews getting extensively involved in lawmaking, linking back to that prominence of legalistic thinking, and asks whether the prophecies related to Judah are still playing out in reality, irrespective of the new covenant.
So the hand in the neck of thine enemies prophecy, the source implies, might be visible in the current geopolitical strength and influence exerted by Israel and its global diaspora.
That seems to be the implication.
And the question of whether the Old Covenant is truly no longer in effect is addressed using a surprising modern analogy.
It is. Source 2 discusses the term obsolete. While the new covenant is a better deal, eternal life versus powerful nations, the fact that it's better doesn't mean God decided to, quote, renege on his original deal.
And the analogy.
The analogy used is the QWERTY keyboard. It's an obsolete layout designed for manual typewriters to prevent key tangling. Those constraints no longer apply to computer keyboards, but the old, inefficient layout remains.
So the prophecy could be obsolete, but still fully operational in the real world.
Exactly. Still explaining the persistent reality of Jewish involvement in law, finance, and influence.
That was a profoundly dense, high-stakes deep dive. We've synthesized two powerful, contrasting narratives. On one hand, Source 1, describing traditional Judaism as a dark, exclusionary, magical system fueling historical conflict and exploitation.
Which gives rise to the need for a berserker defense mechanism.
Right. And on the other hand, Source 2, which acknowledges highly distinctive, sometimes problematic, cultural and legalistic traits, but dismisses the lurid accusations and notes that Jewish participation exists across all major political and economic movements.
And the core goal for you, the learner, was not to choose a side, but to understand the powerful and contradictory narratives that exist regarding these historical and religious claims. We've seen two distinct models attempting to explain the pattern of historical friction and modern influence in the West.
So what does this all mean for the big picture?
Well, Source 1 makes a point about the constant expulsions throughout history. They're estimated at over 100 expulsions over the last 1,000 years. And it's difficult to point to any other group so consistently at bitter odds with its local neighbors. This historical reality demands an explanation.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought. Is the constant historical friction described by the 100 expulsions due to the ritualistic, exclusionary theological core alleged by Source 1?
Or is it primarily a socio-economic friction, exacerbated by a highly effective left-brained legal approach that bypasses social constraints, as suggested by Source 2?
The ultimate question for the modern observer is how these two distinct structural factors, the highly restrictive and separatist cultural patterns and the highly effective legal and financial methods, combine to influence the understanding of group identity and interaction in the modern world.
And potentially enhance their unrecognized influence on society today. It's something to mull over as you process these complex, colliding claims.
That is certainly a challenging note to end on, requiring significant reflection. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly difficult material.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.